Hello and welcome back to Saints of the Week here at the Things That Don't Change. Jumping right in for the 24th week in Ordinary Time. First saint that we have is technically a joint feast day of two different saints. We have Saints Cornelius and Saint Cyprian. So we'll start with Saint Cornelius. So Saint Cornelius, he was born sometime in the late 2nd, early 3rd century. We're not exactly sure what the date was that he was born. He became pope after his predecessor, Pope Fabian, was martyred. So back in the mid 200s, there was great persecutions that were going on in the church. The Roman Empire in general was going through a very rough couple of years. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the crisis of the 3rd century. Basically, this period in Roman history where you had an emperor who would then get deposed in a civil war by another emperor, and then a general would declare himself emperor, and then he would get murdered or assassinated or deposed, and a new guy would come in. So you had like this 50-year period where you had just a successive emperor after emperor after emperor. A lot of strife going on, a lot of barbarian invasions, things like that. So during this time, around the year 251, a man named Decius became the Roman emperor, and one of the first things that he did was to start a persecution against all of the Christians in the empire. So a standard thing that happened whenever Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire is that the emperors would basically put out an order ordering that all citizens were to perform a public religious sacrifice to the gods, to the pagan gods. Obviously, knowing that the Christians, as part of their devotion, were not allowed to do this. They couldn't worship any god but the God of Abraham. If unable to sacrifice to the god, that would out them as a Christian in public, and then they could be put to death, put on trial for that. So in the year 251, while this persecution was going on, the Pope Fabian was martyred along with a lot of the other high-ranking people in the Church of Rome. So there was a vacancy kind of in the seat of Peter around this time. And they were hesitant to fill it while the persecution was still ongoing. However, a little after this time, the persecution itself was halted because Decius, the emperor, went off to fight the Goths, kind of on the borders with Germany. And controversy then arose during this period, about kind of how to handle a lot of the things that had happened during the persecutions, right? So, of course, you had a lot of martyrs, people who were killed because they refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods. A lot of Christians were now, newfound martyrs. However, there were some Christians who, for whatever reason, for personal reasons, because of threats to their family, they went along with the Romans and they agreed to perform these sacrifices to the pagan gods. Basically, they apostatized from the Christian faith. So the question arose, when the persecutions kind of halted for a bit, how do we handle these Christians who had apostatized and had agreed to sacrifice to pagan gods? You kind of had two camps that rose up in this period. You had one camp led by a priest named Novatian, priest of Rome, who said that those who apostatized were not allowed to be reconciled to the church. They claimed that the church had no authority to forgive the sins of these apostates. However, on the other side, you had two men, two priests, Cornelius and Cyprian, and they said that the lapsi, that was the name kind of given to these Christians who had apostatized, they said that the lapsi were able to kind of come back into communion with the church if they repented and went through a period of public penance, and then they would be allowed to kind of resume active ministry. So Novatian, of course, and his followers didn't agree with this. They saw this as kind of a weak-willed answer to the question. So when the papal seat was finally filled, Cornelius himself was elected the new pope. Novatian and his supporters, they kind of resisted Cornelius. They had a lot of power around Rome. A lot of the clergy and some of the lay people in the Rome and the surrounding countryside were supporters of their cause. However, Cornelius had a large weight of the church behind him. Most of the bishops of the East, I think Antioch was kind of the one bishop who kind of was more on the Novatian side of the controversy, but most of the bishops of the East and North Africa were very firmly kind of agreeing with Cornelius that the church had the ability to forgive these sins. So just as long as the lapsi went through a period of penance, they'd be able to come back into the church. Cornelius, declaring that this was the way that the church was going to go about this controversy, had Novatian and his followers who refused to agree with this, had them all excommunicated. So sometime after this, Decius died in battle and was replaced by another Roman emperor by the name of Trebonianus Gallus. And he continued the persecutions, right? So there had been a lull after Decius left Rome. Trebonianus Gallus, returns, and now he's in charge and he wants to continue persecuting the Christians. So it was during this time that Cornelius himself, as the Pope, was arrested. He was exiled to Centumcellae, which is the modern Italian city of Civitavecchia. And then it was here that he was either worked to death or beheaded. So he died here as a martyr for the faith. So now switching over to Cyprian, another kind of figure in this controversy. So Cyprian was born around the year 210 in Carthage, which is in North Africa. He was born to a rich pagan family, and he was given the birth name Thascius. He was a well-known orator in his early adulthood, even though he lived a very dissipate youth. He had a very dissipate youth. He lived a very immoral lifestyle. When he was 35, he was baptized, and then it was around this time they took the name Cyprian. And after being baptized, he gave away a large portion of his wealth to the poor. Kind of gave everything he had up, and then continued to kind of minister to the community. He was a devotee of the church father Tertullian, very influenced by his style. Cyprian was a very prolific writer, and he was ordained a deacon and then later a priest, and then was elected as bishop of Carthage around the year 248, 249. So some in Carthage opposed this. Some of the higher clergy, took issue with Cyprian. However, the common people and most of the church in Carthage was, he was very popular with them. They loved him very much, and they were very happy to see him as their new bishop. So the Decian persecution, which we've talked about, arose soon after this time. And Cyprian went into hiding during this controversy, which brought him a lot of criticism from his opponents, who saw him as a coward, instead of standing up the way, Pope Fabian and people like that did, and, becoming martyrs for the faith, seeing him kind of going away into hiding. They saw that as a bit cowardly. And of course, once the persecution kind of halted for a bit, they had to deal with this Lapsi controversy, as they did in Rome. How would we handle the people who caved to the pressure and apostatized from the faith? So Cyprian, his view was to call for public penance amongst the people who had lapsed, amongst these Christians who had fallen away. He called for public penance, and then they would be readmitted into the church. So the priests in Carthage took a bit of a different view from what we described so far, and they disregarded Cyprian's order, and instead of, making the lapsee go through public penance, they just let them in without anything. They just said, oh, don't worry about it. You can continue to practice as Christians in the church. And of course, this was easier for them to kind of implement because Cyprian was still in hiding around this time. So his physical presence just wasn't present in Carthage to kind of enforce his new law. And then, of course, his enemies, who didn't like him at first, took a lot of issue with the fact that, oh, look, the priests who you're telling to do this, they're going out and they're not even listening to you, so like, well, what does that say about you, Bishop of Carthage? So a schism erupted around this point in Carthage because of this. On one side, you had the Laxist party, who was just kind of, hey, if you apostatize, come back in, no problem, don't worry about it, as if it never happened. And then, of course, you had the Novatians, who were, very present in Carthage too, who said there's no way that any lapsee can come back to the church. So the Laxists, the people who didn't ask the people to do any penance, they elected their own pretender bishop in Cyprian's absence, a man named Fortunatus. The Novatians elected their own bishop of Carthage, a man named Maximius. And then, of course, you had Cyprian, who by this point was starting to kind of come back. The persecution had been halted for a bit, so now he was back in Carthage full time. His moderate position ended up being the one that people tended to gravitate more towards. And, this was especially evident after a plague kind of swept through the city. And, when the people were suffering, when the people kind of were really struggling with this great sickness, Cyprian was kind of the one who was out trying to take care and, just visibly kind of be there for the people, So because of this, that kind of endeared, a lot of people found that very endearing, and they really kind of flocked to his position as clearly seeing, his great love for the people and his great personal sanctity. So in the year 256, another persecution erupted, this time under an emperor named Valerian. Pope Sixtus II was martyred, Sixtus being kind of one of the successors of Cornelius, who had already been martyred by this point. Cyprian was arrested and brought to the local consul, and was asked to participate in the sacrifices to the Roman gods. He refused, of course, proclaiming, faith in Christ. He was banished to a town named Carubus, some distance from Carthage, where he tried to continue his ministry, despite, kind of being in exile. However, he was arrested again by a new consul named Galerius Maximus in 258, and then he was put on trial again. He refused to recant, once again, and then was beheaded in public with many of his disciples soon after this. So, kind of these two martyrs of this period, both, St. Cornelius and St. Cyprian, are kind of honored now on the same day, and their feast day is on September the 16th. So the next saint that we have is St. Hildegard of Bingen. So St. Hildegard was born around the year 1098 in County Palatinate of the Rhine in the Holy Roman Empire. She was the youngest child of a lower noble family of the count of the region. And from a very early age, Hildegard records that she had a great spiritual awareness. She was aware of what she called the umbra viventis lucis, or the reflection of the living light, and just had frequent visions throughout her childhood of, kind of the divine. She became an oblate at a Benedictine monastery in Disse-Bodenberg. We're not exactly sure what the date is when she entered the monastery. There's some conflicting reports on this. She records in some of her writings that she was age of 8 when she started professing her vows with a colleague of hers, Judah von Spotheim, who was 6 years older than her. However, we also know that from Judah's recollections that she entered in 1112 when Hildegard would have been 14 years old, not 8. So there's some discrepancy here. People have decided that probably what happened was that Hildegard started living with Judah when Hildegard was 8 years old. However, they didn't actually enter the monastery itself until 1112. Again, minor point, but just a bit of a historical kind of discrepancy there. So both became a large part of the burgeoning monastery attached to the male Benedictine monastery here. Judah was the one who taught Hildegard to read and write. And Hildegard, while she was here, began to have a deep interest in music and began playing music on her own. And she also may have been taught the Psalter by a monk named Volmar. And in 1136, Judah passed away. And then it was around this time that the abbot asked Hildegard to be the new prioress. However, Hildegard instead desired to move the nuns to a new monastery in Rupertsberg. This was something that kind of she'd been praying about, and that she felt that God was kind of calling her to do. The abbot denied this request, and Hildegard, again, feeling like this was something that God wanted her to do, went over his head and then appealed to the Archbishop Henry I of Mainz. So the abbot continued to refuse to relent, now a little upset that Hildegard went over his head. However, Hildegard soon became very sick, just with an illness that had been kind of passing through, and the sight of her, kind of stuck in bed, kind of moved the abbot to allow her to start this new monastery. So in 1150, she and some of her religious sisters arrived in Rupertsberg. Volmar, the monk who she had been close friends with, became her confessor and scribe around this time. Throughout her life, she continued to have many visions of God. She kept most of these secret for many years, only telling Judah and eventually Volmar. However, God at one point told her in a vision to start writing some of these down. So Civius was the name of the work that she composed to kind of compile a lot of her visions, a lot of her thoughts. She taught, amongst other things in here, that humans were what she called the spark of God's love, kind of coming from, she kind of described it as, the humans kind of come from God the way that kind of daylight comes from the sun. She saw the harmony just of creation and the place of humans and all of that all around her. And in the year 1147, Pope Eugenius became aware of her writings, became very interested in them and approved her to continue them. Hildegard was somebody who was well sought all over Christian Europe. A lot of people would write her letters asking for spiritual advice, and she wrote upwards of 300 letters in response to a lot of these requests. These included many the famous people of the day, including Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. She was also known for writing many sacred hymns, antiphons, and liturgical songs. And Hildegard also came to a bit of controversy later in life because she approved the burial of a young man on the grounds of her monastery, although this young man had, before this point, been excommunicated by the church. Being said about this, her local ordinary, the local bishop, placed the whole monastery under interdict, right? So basically, excommunication, that's a person who gets excommunicated, they're kind of cut off from the church. And interdict is kind of an excommunication against a place, right? So like a city can be under interdict, or a monastery in this case. So the interdict was kind of placed on her monastery for kind of approving this burial. However, she always protested that, because she had these visions and, God talked to her, yet she was very certain that this young man wasn't right graces with God when he passed and, received the sacraments on his deathbed. So this interdict was eventually lifted sometime before she died. And she died at this monastery on the 17th of September in the year 1179. The sisters of her, their religious sisters, they said that they saw 2 streams of light appear in the sky after she passed, crossing over the room where she had been sick. Her canonization process was started very soon after her death. And it was actually one of the first that kind of went through the formal process of canonizations that, had been started around the same period. She was beatified soon after. However, the cause was stalled many, many times over the centuries, just, for various issues that arise, whether it's just not, on the fast track or there's no one to take up the cause, things like that. It just took a very long time for her to actually get official recognition after beatification. However, ever since she was beatified, people popularly would refer to her as Saint Hildegard. However, she wasn't officially canonized until the year 2012, when Pope Benedict XVI had her canonized and also named a Doctor of the Church. And her feast day is on September the 17th. So the next feast that we have, the next saint, is Saint Robert Bellarmine. So Saint Bellarmine was born on the 4th of October in the year 1542 at Monte Pulciano, which was in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in Italy. Robert's parents were of noble stock. His father was Vincenzo Bellarmino, and his mother was Cinzia Cervini, who was the sister of Pope Marcellus II. Robert grew up, very well learned. Was very well educated. He knew Virgil from a very young age, and also could compose poems. Knew both Latin and Italian. He entered the Jesuit novitiate in the year 1560, and spent 3 years in Rome, kind of training for this. He was eventually stationed in Mondovi in Piedmont, which is in northern Italy, and it was here that he also learned Greek. He was sent to the University of Padua by a well-known Jesuit of the time named Francesco Ardono, and it was at Padua that he first was introduced to the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas and became kind of very proficient in Thomism. He finished his studies at the University of Leuven in the Duchy of Brabant, which is in modern-day Belgium. And in the year 1570, he became a professor and preacher at this university after he was ordained. And then kind of became the first Jesuit to kind of teach here. And, a lot of his classes would involve teaching the Summa Theologica. He worked in Leuven for 7 years and then returned to Italy in the year 1576 due to his health was waning a bit, so he was kind of sent home. Once he arrived back in Rome, he taught at the Roman College, now known as the Pontifical Gregorian University. And, he was kind of stationed here by Pope Gregory XIII. So during his time at the Roman College, he lectured in polemical theology. So basically, the study of theology and kind of also how to argue that against heretical views. This, of course, was in the period right after the Protestant Reformation, right? The Council of Trent had ended in 1563. So this is the birth of the Counter-Reformation. So there's a lot of just lecturing and understanding of theology going on to kind of combat these newfound Protestant ideas. So during this time that Robert Bellarmine became very familiar with Protestantism and kind of argued against that theology. He collated a lot of his work into a book known as De Controversies, which he published at this time. In the year 1590, he went with Cardinal Gaetano to France on orders of the Pope. Pope Sixtus V, and basically they were here and they were tasked with solidifying the position of the church kind of amidst a lot of the religious and political upheaval going on in France at this time. He returned to Rome soon after and served as a spiritual director to Aloysius Gonzaga, who we talked about a couple of months ago on Saints of the Week. These were kind of the final years before Gonzaga passed away, and after Gonzaga died, Robert Bellarmine was actually one of the main proponents of getting him beatified in the year 1605. So Robert sat on the council, which oversaw the revision of the Latin Vulgate. So basically, the Council of Trent ended in 1563, and one of the things that the council called for, was a standardization of the Mass, the Tridentine Mass as we now know it, and also kind of a revision of the Latin Vulgate, which, of course, the Church had been using for many, many hundreds of years. So the revision had been started in the intervening decades. However, there was a bit of a controversy because Sixtus V, who we already mentioned, who was Pope, he inserted some of his own revisions into the text. However, it was quickly found out all of this, this text was never promulgated, but of course, as they're trying to come up with the final version, they get all these changes from the Pope, and it's clear that there's a lot of errors kind of in the translation and kind of a lot of the stuff going on there. It was just a very bad kind of translation of the Vulgate. So after the Pope died, this council, which Robert was on, was trying to figure out, what do we do now? We don't want to make the Pope look bad by saying, yeah, he basically did an awful translation, but at the same time, we can't use it because this is not a good Vulgate. So Robert kind of helped mediate some of that and basically help reissue an updated version while at the same time, including a preface that was very deferential to the memory of the late Pope, Sixtus V. So Robert became rector of the Roman College in the year 1592, and then provincial of Naples, kind of the head Jesuit of Naples, in 1595. However, he returned to Rome in 1597 and made the personal theologian of Pope Clement VIII. And he was also named examiner of bishops and consultor of the Holy Office. The Holy Office being the what we would now refer to as the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith. Back then was called the Holy Office, or the Inquisition. So Robert was also named a cardinal around this time. And one of the things he helped moderate was a bit of a controversy that had arisen between two camps in the church, the Thomists and the Molinists. The Molinists named for Spanish Jesuit Luis de Molina, who kind of posited their views. And the controversy which came up, a little hard to explain. I put it in the ChatGPT and I still don't understand what exactly they're arguing about. Basically, it was about free will and how do we understand the intricacies of free will from a Catholic perspective. The church, of course, has a teaching on free will, that we have it. But the specific ways of kind of how God allows us to have free will and, what he knows and all of that. And a lot of that's kind of more technical language and not necessarily doctrine of the church. So there's some room for theological disagreement there. So you had St. Thomas Aquinas posited his answer to that. More recently to this time period, Luis de Molina had posited his opinion to that. And then these two camps had arisen, the Thomists and the Molinists, who were kind of arguing back and forth about who was more correct. And it was a very acrimonious debate amongst the theologians. Robert's position was that, he just wanted to encourage more debate. There were a lot of people at this time who kind of wanted to center the other side or, have these sweeping condemnations. But Robert said, look, these are both within the realm of orthodoxy. So we just talk about it and continue to understand exactly what's going on here. However, a lot of people didn't agree with this. He had a friend in Pope Clement for a bit. However, then Clement kind of decided to go with a different approach than the one he wanted. So it was around the same time that Robert Bellarmine was made the Archbishop of Capua, the city in southern Italy. And some people say that this was kind of Clement promoting him to kind of get him out of Rome, since he didn't agree with his position on this controversy anymore. Again, who knows? Because Clement also personally kind of installed him and consecrated him. And this was kind of seen as a very high honor. So clearly, the Pope really respected him and wanted him in this position. So Robert spent 3 years as Archbishop of Capua. When Clement died in 1605, Robert was part of the conclave that elected Pope Leo XI, and then also part of the conclave, which 26 days later had to meet after Leo died, 26 days into his reign, and then also elected Pope Paul V. So Robert's name was kind of always in the running. People always kind of threw his name around there as a possible candidate to be Pope. However, he was ultimately passed over because he was a Jesuit. Around this time, a lot of cardinals were still kind of suspicious of having a Jesuit as Pope. And it's actually not for many hundreds of years that we had our first Jesuit Pope under Pope Francis. He, in 2013, was elected our first official Jesuit Pope. So Pope Paul V recalled Cardinal Bellarmine to Rome after he got elected. And Bellarmine resigned his post as Archbishop of Capua at this point because for many years he had always been kind of a very staunch critic of bishops who didn't live in their diocese. So, he was kind of like, Pope Paul, if you want me to kind of come and be and minister in Rome with you, I have to resign because, I won't be able to be an Archbishop of this city while I'm in a different city. I'm not okay with that. The Pope said, sure, you can resign because I really want you in Rome. So Robert came back to Rome. Became the chief theologian under Pope Paul V. The Thominist-Molinist controversy was still kind of going on. However, Pope Paul V was kind of more amenable to Robert's position, so that's kind of the way that it ended up being settled at this point. Another thing that Cardinal Bellarmine got involved with around this time was the controversy over Catholics in England. So this was in the early 17th century. So Elizabeth, who was a big suppressor of the Catholic Church in England as a Protestant. She had died, and she was succeeded by the Stuart King James I. And this was a bit of a tough time in England because you had a bunch of Catholic separatists, led by Robert Catesby and Guy Fawkes, who had tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament in the Gunpowder Plot, which failed. And because of this, there's a lot of ill will towards Catholics in the country. So kind of a new loyalty oath was kind of declared, which basically was worded in such a way that Catholics were not able to actually, accept this oath. So, if they said, hey, say this oath, and the person didn't say it, it's like, oh, well, you're probably a Catholic then. So then they were able to kind of go after them for that. So King James I kind of wrote a treatise kind of upholding this new oath. So Cardinal Bellarmine wrote a long essay kind of denouncing it. Another thing that Cardinal Bellarmine was involved with around this time was the early stages of the Galileo affair. So we talked about the Galileo affair briefly when we were talking about St. Joseph Calasanz a couple weeks ago. So in 1615, this controversy was kind of getting started. You had Galileo, who was was a student of Copernicus who had first kind of started to cast doubt on the idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe. Since ancient Greek times, this was kind of the understanding of how the universe worked. However, Copernicus and then eventually Galileo were the ones that kind of say, it seems that maybe actually the sun is at the center of the universe, which, as we know today, isn't correct, because the sun is actually in the center of the sun is in the center of the solar system, not in the center of the universe. But it's more correct than the idea that the Earth is at the center of anything. Cardinal Bellarmine was very interested in Galileo's findings and was on very friendly terms with Galileo. And one of Robert Bellarmine's approaches was that, if a scientific theory has insufficient evidence, then it should only be put forth as a hypothesis, which is basically kind of standard scientific method. Of course, as the controversy went on, that kind of became the sticking point. Galileo kind of charged forth with a little more surety in his ideas, as was warranted given the evidence. And then when there was some pushback by the church, including a pope, who was very dismissive of Galileo, there was a bit of a personal controversy. And then, Galileo was put under house arrest. And then the rest is history. But back in this early stage, there were a lot of churchmen like Cardinal Bellarmine or St. Joseph Calasanz who were kind of amenable to Galileo and his theory and interested in what he had to say. So when the Holy Office did take issue with Galileo's theory, and Galileo started to push a little too hard, Bellarmine was kind of the one who was elected to kind of go in and inform him that he kind of needed to pull back a bit. On the 17th of September in the year 1621, Cardinal Bellarmine died at the age of 78. And he died at the Sant'Andrea degli Scosenza, the Jesuit College of St. Andrew in Rome. And he was buried at the Church of St. Ignatius, also in Rome. And, just throughout his life, he kind of left behind this legacy of just being a very humble and lived in great poverty, was very charitable to the poor. He was seen as a very, very holy man. People thought he was a shoo-in. He'd be very quickly declared a saint because he just had this great reputation. However, the actual beatification process was put off for a very long time due to a lot of political reasons. Being a high-ranking churchman, he had people who liked him, had people who didn't like him. There's a lot of other things going on throughout the centuries in Rome. So he actually wasn't beatified until the year 1923 under Pope Pius XI, and then eventually canonized in 1930, also by Pope Pius XI. And his feast day is on September the 17th. The next saint that we have is Saint Januarius. So Saint Januarius was born around the year 272. And we know very little about his life or his martyrdom, for that matter. He's held to be the Bishop of Benevento in Italy. And he was likely killed during the Diocletian persecution. This is kind of the last big Christian persecutions before Constantine legalized Christianity in 313. And so again, we don't know too much about it. The most we have is a couple of legendary sources about his life and martyrdom. One account says that he was thrown into a furnace, him and his companions. However, his body didn't burn. So he was taken out, and then him and his companions were thrown into the amphitheater, so that the wild animals would kind of devour them alive. However, the animals didn't bother to eat them or go anywhere near them. So at this point, the Roman officials saw that there was some sort of wicked magic at play here. So he ordered him and his companions be beheaded. But then the executioner that they had brought to behead him was struck blind before he could do that. And Januarius restored the executioner's sight. And then many of the onlookers who were seeing all these great miracles, it's recorded as many as 5,000 people were kind of converted as the martyrs were kind of being beheaded and became Christians due to this. This would be around the year 305. So after his death, the relics of St. Januarius ended up in Naples, where many miracles were recorded. And this includes his blood, which was kind of kept in a glass vial. Now, his blood is probably the most famous thing about him. It's said to have been retrieved from the site of his martyrdom by a holy woman named Eusebia, and then kept in a sealed container through the centuries. However, again, since there's such a lack of information, the first attestation we have to his blood being kept is in the year 1389. So over 1,000 years later. His blood is recorded as liquefying several times over many years and then resolidifying and then kind of liquefying again at different times. There's certain dates where it more reliably happens, right? So September 19th, the day of his feast, December the 16th, which is the patronage of Naples, and also the Saturday before the Sunday of May, which is the commemoration of the reunification of his relics. So the church has no official teaching on what to make of this blood. It's kind of been a veneration been an object of veneration up down the centuries. The church doesn't disapprove it, but the church also doesn't say, hey, this is definitely a miracle, or this is something we're all bound to kind of see as miraculous. Some limited scientific tests have been run. However, we're not able to kind of get a really kind of efficient test because we'd have to kind of, take the blood out of the vial, and then people are concerned that if that happens, that'll kind of damage it. So they don't want to do that. However, kind of some tests have been run, and people have a hard time explaining exactly what's going on here. Blood obviously can liquefy. However, that resolidification of the blood, that's something that doesn't tend to happen. So people are just a bit confused from a scientific perspective as to what is going on here. So again, this is something that you can go still see today. I'm at the church where it's kept. And, on certain feast days, doesn't always happen on all the same days, but rather consistently on the days mentioned, and also other special events, the blood has been known to kind of liquefy before then resolidifying to liquefy again at a different date. And the feast day of St. Januarius is on September the 19th. So the final two saints that we have today, another joint feast day, we have St. Andrew Kim Taegon, St. Paul Chong Hasang, and companions. So starting with Andrew Kim Taegon. So he was born on the 24th of August in the year 1821 in Bingen in Korea, so a Korean martyr. He was born in the Yangbang class, which was kind of the noble class of the Kingdom of Korea at this time. Both of his parents and their families were all converts to Christianity, and they were all eventually martyred. Kim himself was baptized at age 15. And soon after this, he went to the Portuguese colony of Macau, which is a city in China, to enter seminary. And during his time training to be a priest, he studied both in the Philippines and also in Shanghai, which in Shanghai is where he was eventually ordained. He was ordained in the year 1844 by the French bishop Jean-Joseph Jean-Baptiste Ferrol, who was the kind of the official bishop of Korea around this time. And then he returned to Korea 6 years later as the first Korean-born Catholic priest. And then in this time, it was illegal to be a Christian in Korea. The Korean state was a heavily Confucian state, and the Christian faith was suppressed and persecuted. Kim's father Ignatius was martyred in the year 1839. And then in the year 1846, Kim was arrested while he was secretly ministering to the Catholic community. And then he himself was also executed at the age of 25. The same year. And he's recorded with saying on his deathbed, quote, "This is the last hour of life. Listen to me attentively." This is him speaking to the men who are about to execute him. Quote, "If I have held communication with foreigners, it has been for my religion and my God. It is for him that I die. My immortal life is on the point of beginning. Become Christians if you wish to be happy after death, because God has eternal chastisements in store for those who have refused to know him." So kind of this one last plea to his executioners to kind of become Christians themselves and be able to enjoy the fruits of eternal life with God. So Bishop Farrell, in 1853, when he died, one of his desires was to be buried next to this holy priest, that he had ordained and then also been very close friends with. He very much saw Andrew Kim Taegon as a son, and the saint saw him as a spiritual father. So Andrew Kim Taegon was beatified by Pope Pius XI in 1925. And we'll get to his canonization in a second because we have another saint to talk about, that being Paul Chong Hasang. So Paul Chong Hasang was born around the year 1794-1795. His father was a man named Augustin Chong Yejong, who himself was also a martyr. And actually, when Paul was age 7, his father, his mother, and his eldest brother, they were all arrested and martyred. The rest of the children, including Paul, were spared at this time and then sent to a rural home to grow up. Upon reaching adulthood, Paul served as a servant to a government interpreter, and kind of due to this position, he traveled a lot and was able to travel to Beijing as part of his work. And it was while he was in Beijing that he made contact with the Catholic bishop there, and they kind of helped facilitate priests being sent to Korea, right? So we had the Bishop of Beijing write a letter to Pope Gregory XVI, and then Pope Gregory XVI had the first diocese in Korea established in 1825. So Bishop Laurent Marie Joseph Imbert, a French bishop, was the first to be named Bishop of Korea. Bishop Imbert found Hasang, when he met him, to be a very well-learned man. He was very interested in kind of having him as a priest in the diocese, and then taught him Latin and theology, and had planned to ordain him. However, a great persecution broke out, and both Bishop Humbert and Hasang were arrested. Hasang was tortured and asked to recant his faith. However, he wrote a written defense of Catholicism, but the government policy couldn't be changed or ignored. So although the judge was kind of like, yeah, this is a very well-written defense, the law is the law, and we can't give you a reprieve. So he was tortured further, but again, still refused to recant his faith, and then was martyred along with Bishop Humbert in 1839. And he was also beatified by Pope Pius XI in 1925. Now, St. Andrew Kim Taegon and Paul Chong Hasang, they were both martyred, or they were both canonized, along with at least 103 other Korean martyrs by Pope St. John Paul II in 1984. So the two of them, along with many, many others who had tried their best to bring the Catholic faith to Korea, were kind of honored in this ceremony, and now all share a joint feast day of September the 20th. So that's all we have for today. Lot going on, but I hope you all have a blessed week, and I'll see you here next week for more Saints of the Week.